All right, so let's talk about drugs a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think this is an interesting place for the libertarian or the classical liberal. You basically think that our war on drugs is completely ridiculous, right?
One of the worst policies ever.
Yeah. What would be a better policy related to drugs?
Well, I think there are two things to do. The first thing is quite simply to legalize drugs.
Across the board.
Across the board. What people do not realize is until the 1890s, any drug was freely available. If you were in a chemist in Great Britain until 1922, the United States until the 1890s, you could go in, you could order opium, you could order morphine. Arthur Conan Doyle could go to the chemist in London and get his weekly supply of cocaine, serious coke habit, which is why Sherlock Holmes has a coke habit in the stories.
I did not know that.
So this regime we now have has been created piecemeal since the 1920s, basically. So it's not inevitable. It's a specific policy response. And the results of it have been catastrophic. It has led to incredibly high rates of incarceration here in the United States, which means countless lives ruined and severely damaged, if not destroyed. It means it's given enormous amounts of money to some seriously evil and unpleasant people and led to the growth of an enormous network of international organized crime, which would not otherwise exist. In terms of the geopolitics, this is one of the major ways terrorist organizations get money. It's a catastrophe in terms of that. It's undermined the stability of large parts of the world, like Colombia, for example. Increasingly, that's one of the reasons why Venezuela is in bad shape, quite apart from the incompetence of the government there. Mexico, we all know there's like a war going on in some parts of Mexico at the moment. So this is, and it hasn't even done the thing it's meant to do, which is reduce the use of drugs, where in fact, actually this has gone up. Not only that, but an inevitable result of this policy is that the suppliers and the users both go for harder drugs because you want to get more bang for the buck. You want also to sell and to use products that are less bulky, easier to conceal. Same thing has happened with Prohibition during the 1920s, where the Americans went from being a beer drinking nation to being a hard liquor drinking nation, which is not what you want. What you want to do is control alcohol drinking. So I would say that this, in terms of its own goals, this is a catastrophic policy failure. Now, having said that, I'm not one of these people who is channeling Timothy O'Leary and thinks that drugs are good for you. There's no doubt there is a problem with widespread use of drugs. It's worth saying, by the way, that the real problem in many ways, not least here in the United States, is the massive increase in the use of prescription drugs. The number of people who are on psychotropic, mood-altering drugs is staggering. And it has grown dramatically since the 1960s. So there's a more general problem of drug use in advanced countries, particularly North America, of which illegal drug use is a subset. Now,
am I mistaken? Are you guys in Britain? You don't have the commercials we have, right? Are they not legal there? We get every commercial on especially on cable news. Is for all of the prescription drugs.
No, that's not allowed now. That's not allowed under the advertising regulations in the United Kingdom.
That might be a regulation I'd be for, actually.
Well, actually, I must say, it is strange when you're watching afternoon television in the United States, you're going to think, does everyone in this country suffer from enlarged prostate?
Yeah, and you got that cartoon cloud following you.
Anyway, so the thing is, what I think is that what you need to do is to have a social movement to address the undoubted real problems of the drug trade, which you could do if the government got out of this. And my model would be temperance, where in the 19th century, at the start of the 19th century, on both sides of the Atlantic, pretty much everyone was in a drunken stupor most of the time. The amount of drinking was phenomenal. And by the 1880s or 1890s, most British and the great majority of Americans have become seriously sober people who maybe drink very occasionally. They're not heavy drinkers the way their grandparents have been. That is not due to government. It's due to the enormous social movement of temperance, which unfortunately also wanted to use the law to stop the residual 10% from drinking. If you think about smoking, okay, I'm not keen on all the anti-smoking laws we have, but on the other hand, there's been a huge change in social attitudes to smoking, which has made it socially just not the thing to do, to smoke in company. That's the way to address the undoubted problem that we have with drugs. It's through social action of that kind. The war on drugs is actually making that kind of effective social action less likely and causing a ton of other problems.
Is the smoking one must be a tough one for you, though, because on one hand, at least here, our taxes are incredibly high on smoking. So this is a government, so they sort of tried to price it out of the market, which I guess you wouldn't really be for.
I don't think they are trying to price it out of the market, quite
frankly. Or they're trying to maximize their profits.
They're trying to maximize their revenue, which is something different. Because the theory of these taxes is they're meant to stop you and I buying cigarettes. But actually, I don't know about the US government, the British government would have a panic fit if people stopped smoking because they get £7 billion a year of revenue from smoking taxes.
Right, so in a weird way, they need it.
Exactly. Plus also, they really ought to encourage people to smoke because if you smoke, you're likely to die younger and you won't be claiming a whole bunch of healthcare benefits and things.
Right.
But no, the point about that is actually a very bad policy because the demand for cigarettes and tobacco products is highly inelastic. And so what you're doing actually is hurting the poor more than anybody else. There are other ways of doing it. Like I say, social pressure.
Yeah. So what about for the person? So I'm pretty much with you on the philosophical part of how the government should deal with this and the actual tangible part of drugs. I would have some concern if they just say, if heroin was legal tomorrow and kids could just get it at a corner store. Look, we're here in LA, there are pot stores on every corner. I have a license for it, so I'm not doing something illegal. But what do you do for the real, I'm not even talking about the Timothy Leary mushroom stuff, I'm talking about the really addictive stuff.
Well, actually, some of the drugs that are, I'd be much more worried about things like sedatives or cocaine than I would be about heroin, actually, interestingly, but that's another matter. The thing is, to say that drugs should be sold legally does not mean there'd be a complete free-for-all. There would quite clearly be regulations, for example, saying that people cannot buy them below a certain age, just as we have with alcohol and tobacco, for good reason, because you think that somebody under a certain age, which you set arbitrarily, does not have the judgment to know whether or not they should do this. And you should enforce laws like that very, very strictly and very, very firmly. You might well have a system where certain categories of drugs or substances, you basically say, well, you could do what the Swedish government tried with alcohol and have a rationing system. There are various ways around that. The point is, it wouldn't be just a case of, oh, you can walk into any store and just buy your shots of morphine and heroin over the counter like everything else. Almost certainly there would be a whole array of legislation. The point is it would be sold by a legal retailer who would have strong incentives to have high quality product, not to sell it to people who are going to be problematic in one way or another, because they would have a vicarious liability under the law, for example. And unlike the situation at the moment where they're being sold by seriously dodgy people, criminals of the worst kind, who actually have an incentive to not care about who they sell it to or how they sell it. So actually, if you're concerned about protecting vulnerable people, which is what we're talking about here, then actually making the sale of this substance legal is the way to go, because it means that you're much more likely to be able to look out for their interests, and the sellers are much less likely to have an incentive to screw them over, to be blunt about it.
Right, and interestingly, it gets back to sort of what's been the through line here, which is that a little government involvement in a certain way could be okay. So I almost think that my new phrase now, when people say classical, what's a classical liberal? I almost think it's a realistic libertarian. Do you think that's a
That's a good way of putting it, yes, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is, say, very often limited government, and smart limited government even more so, is a lot more effective at achieving the ends that big government liberals want it to have than a big government is. That's a very good way of thinking.
I think that's a perfect way to end this. It's been a pleasure. I didn't look down once. That's how I know it's a good one. For more on Dr. Steve Davies, you can check out learnliberty.org/speakers/Steve-Davies. Thanks for watching, and we'll do it again next week.